Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something a little darker. A world of plagues, punishments, and pottage. We're exploring what daily life was truly like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry Hollywood has always romanticized. The reality is, you probably wouldn't survive a single day. So before we get into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always great to see who's joining from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some background noise, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the year 1325. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so are the fleas. Your bed is a half-rotted straw mattress packed with insects and hay that smells like a barn floor, because 3 months ago, it was one. There's no memory foam, no pillows, and absolutely no soft cotton sheets. Just a wool blanket that hasn't been washed since last winter, now weighing roughly as much as a small cow from all the built-up grime. You wake to the sound of a church bell ringing in the distance, the medieval equivalent of an alarm clock, only louder and considerably less forgiving. Your home is a wooden hut with a single room, no windows, and an open layout where your family, livestock, and household insects all share the same space. The smell is overwhelming, a combination of stale ale, human sweat, farm animals, and something you hope isn't mold, but deep down you already know it is. Scented candles don't exist yet, and even if they did, they'd simply melt into your dirt floor. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it. The air is freezing and your joints are stiff. You're 22 years old, which in medieval terms is roughly middle-aged. Your spine creaks like an old wooden door, and your knees sound like gravel rattling in a bucket. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor is either damp from last night's rain leaking through the thatched roof, or crusted with something your neighbor's chicken left behind. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the ecosystem. As for privacy, that concept doesn't exist here. Your entire family, and possibly a cousin who simply never left, are all waking up beside you. No separate rooms, no curtains, no personal space, just communal everything. Welcome to a medieval morning in Europe, where you're never truly alone because parasites, rodents, and several other people are always present. And this is only the beginning of your day. It gets considerably worse from here. So you've managed to pull yourself out of that medieval haystack. Well done. Now nature is calling, and it isn't being polite about it. This is where you'll really start to miss modern plumbing. There's no toilet, no seat, no tissue paper, no flush mechanism, and not even a plunger within reach. In 14th century Europe, relieving yourself is a logistical challenge, a social experiment, and frequently a semi-public event. If you're a peasant, your bathroom is most likely a wooden bucket behind the house, already full because someone in the household had a rough night after eating questionable turnips. The smell is overwhelming. You hold your breath, handle your business, and then comes the part that takes some adjustment. You toss the contents into the street. Yes, the street. Convention calls for shouting something like "Garde-l'eau" before emptying it from the window. That's Old French for "watch out below," though in practice, nobody ever moves fast enough. Medieval town streets function essentially as open sewers, a persistent flow of human waste, animal droppings, and unidentified liquids best left unexamined. If you're fortunate enough to live near public latrines, you get to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in a shared outhouse where privacy is non-existent and ventilation is a generous term. Toilet paper is unheard of. Most people use straw, leaves, rags, moss, or the occasional scrap of wool. Sometimes nothing at all, which may partly explain why handshakes weren't yet a widespread custom. And if you live in a castle, surely things are better? To some degree. You might have access to a garderobe, a gap in the wall that channels waste directly into the moat. Clever in concept, except your enemies are well aware of it. Some attackers historically climbed in through that exact opening. So whether you're a farmhand or a baron, the medieval bathroom experience is humiliating. It's cold, exposed, hazardous, and consistently unpleasant. One wrong step on a slick stone path and you're face down in something you'd rather not think about. And you still haven't addressed your teeth, but we'll get there shortly. You made it through the toilet ordeal. You deserve something decent in return, right? A warm, satisfying breakfast, perhaps? Not a chance. This is medieval Europe. Comfort is in short supply. Breakfast, if it can even be called that, is a cheerless experience. There are no elaborate dishes, no hot beverages waiting on the counter, and certainly no fresh produce artfully arranged on a plate. You crouch near the fire with a wooden bowl of something that looks like it was scraped from a muddy surface. Welcome to your daily serving of pottage. Pottage is a thick, dense stew assembled from whatever is available: grains, root vegetables, beans if you're fortunate. It simmers in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks, with new ingredients added on top of old ones. It's less of a prepared meal and more of an ongoing culinary experiment with no clear end date. Beside it sits a chunk of bread so dense it could cause genuine injury. It's baked from coarse rye or barley flour, often supplemented with sawdust, ground acorns, or other unconventional fillers because wheat is reserved for the wealthy. This loaf is not something you enjoy, it's something you endure. What about something to drink? It won't be juice or anything freshly prepared. It's beer. At 6 in the morning. The reason is practical. Water sources are contaminated and riddled with parasites, so weak ale becomes the default beverage. Children drink it as well. Nobody is particularly enthusiastic about this arrangement, but it's the safer option. Meat or cheese? That's reserved for Sundays, religious feast days, and only if your lord is in a generous mood. Most peasants consume meat only a handful of times per year. Fresh fruit appears only when in season and hasn't already been converted into wine. Spices are entirely out of reach unless you're part of the nobility. A small amount of pepper costs more than a month's earnings for a common worker. Salt is considered valuable enough to be kept under lock and key. So you chew through your dense bread, drink your morning ale, and try not to dwell on the fact that a rat may have gotten into your porridge overnight. Breakfast doesn't leave you feeling restored. It just gets you through to the next hour. And now that you're appropriately underfed, it's time to work as though your survival depends on it. Because in this era, it genuinely does. You've had your bleak medieval breakfast. Now it's time to get dressed. Not that it's going to help much. Your entire wardrobe is a single outfit. Just one. A rough wool tunic or linen shift that you've worn every day for months, possibly longer. Seasonal fashion doesn't exist here. You simply wear the same garment until it falls apart or triggers a skin infection. Undergarments are optional. If circumstances are favorable, you might have a linen layer underneath. If not, you're wearing nothing beneath scratchy, sweat-soaked wool, all assembled by someone with a loose understanding of how stitching is supposed to work. There's no washing machine, no soap, and no cleaning service anywhere nearby. Your clothes are stained, rigid, and carry a scent somewhere between a compost heap and a livestock pen that's been left unattended for weeks. Even attempting to clean them is an ordeal. You'd need to haul water from a river, heat it over an open fire, scrub the fabric against a board using ash or lye, then hang it out in sunlight that appears roughly 3 days out of the year. And footwear is no better. If you own shoes at all, they're made from untreated leather, poorly stitched, and offer about as much structural support as a piece of fruit. Most peasants simply walk barefoot through mud, animal waste, and the medieval equivalent of a minefield, sharp stones and pools of disease. The result of all this is straightforward. Your skin is in a constant state of protest. The itching never stops. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs take up permanent residence on your body without paying any kind of rent. Nobody is exempt. Nobles, monks, children, everyone is hosting some variety of parasite. You'll find yourself scratching your armpit mid-conversation with a priest, and not a single person will react with surprise. Your skin is raw from constant friction. Your scalp is a landscape of insect bites. And if a rash develops, there's nothing to be done about it. No specialist, no topical treatment, no diagnosis. You simply continue on with it, and that rash will become your uninvited companion for the next several months. Now that you're dressed in discomfort and wrapped in damp wool, it's time to step outside and begin the work that will gradually wear your body down. Fully clothed in itchiness and damp fabric, the next order of business might seem like a simple morning routine, but not here. In the Middle Ages, your teeth are largely on their own, and they are not holding up well. There is no toothbrush, no paste, no rinse, and no floss. Oral hygiene is about as widespread a practice as bathing, which is to say it's hardly practiced at all. Some individuals might chew on a small twig or rinse with diluted wine or vinegar, but beyond that, dental care is essentially non-existent. By the time you reach your mid-20s, your teeth look like something excavated from an old ruin. Cavities are widespread, gums are inflamed, and what appears on the surface isn't just discoloration, it's active decay. Sugar, though not yet as common as it would later become, is beginning to appear among the wealthy, imported at significant expense and used primarily in small confections or as a display of status. If you're a noble, congratulations, you get to accelerate the deterioration of your teeth ahead of everyone else. If you're poor, the same outcome arrives more gradually through fermented bread, coarse porridge, and years of demanding chewing. Toothaches become a permanent background condition, like weather, always present. The pain reaches a point where people consider three options: praying, drinking, or removing the tooth personally with basic tools. And that last option was a genuine medical practice of the time. Dentistry as a discipline didn't really exist, but barbersurgeons did. The same individual responsible for cutting your hair was also the one extracting your molars by candlelight with an iron instrument and no anesthetic whatsoever. An infected tooth doesn't just mean pain. It means fever, and without antibiotics, it can progress into sepsis and become fatal. Something that a modern pharmacy resolves in a day could end your life in the 14th century. On a social level, there's no relief either. Bad breath is universal. You aren't evaluated by the quality of your smile, you're assessed by your land and your livestock. In short, your mouth is losing a battle it was never equipped to win. Now that the ache in your teeth has settled in, it's time to head outside, because the work that will strain every part of your body is just beginning. There's no office, no desk, no scheduled break, and absolutely no possibility of advancement. Your occupation, if you belong to the roughly 90% of the population working the land, is uncomplicated in its demands. Labor continuously for someone else's benefit, and try not to die in the process. You are a peasant. That means you work fields that belong to a lord who likely does not know your name. You begin at sunrise and continue until the light disappears behind the trees. Your equipment consists of a wooden hoe, a worn sickle, and whichever joints in your body are still functioning adequately. There is no concept of a weekend. There is no clocking out. There is only daylight hours across 6 days a week. Sundays are technically rest days, unless the harvest demands attention, raiders appear, or you're occupied fervently praying that the infection spreading through your foot decides to stop progressing. The labor itself is relentless. Fields are broken up by hand or with oxen if you're among those fortunate enough to own one. You dig channels, plant seeds, remove weeds, and haul water until your posture begins to curve under the accumulated strain. Nobody inquires about your exhaustion. Nobody is concerned with your well-being. For women, the workload is compounded. Field duties, child rearing, cleaning, cooking, spinning wool, managing livestock, all while tolerating whatever domestic inconveniences come with shared living. Children begin contributing around the age of 5. No formal education, no leisure, just a small set of tools and the modest aspiration of surviving childhood illness. For those not working in agriculture, blacksmiths, tanners, coopers, the conditions are different but no less punishing. You spend your days working with fire, corrosive materials, or raw animal products in spaces with little ventilation. Compensation amounts to basic survival. The benefits include occasional injury. Break a bone and you're expected to continue. Develop a fever and you're advised to drink warm ale and carry on. Stopping is not a viable option, because the absence of work means the absence of food, and medieval society has no patience for gaps in productivity. You will simply be replaced. So you hold your tools, ignore the open sores on your hands, and keep working. In the Middle Ages, your occupation isn't a livelihood, it's a prolonged test of physical endurance. With your back already aching from a full day in the fields, let's turn to the weather. Because in the Middle Ages, seasonal conditions aren't just an inconvenience, they're a form of ongoing hardship. Winter, in particular, is a serious adversary. There is no insulation in your walls, no central heating of any kind, and certainly no forecast to prepare you for what's coming. Your home has wooden walls with gaps wide enough to push a chicken through. Windows are covered with fabric, not glass. The hearth fire, appealing in theory, doesn't burn long enough to make a meaningful difference because firewood is costly and collecting it from nearby forests is frequently prohibited by law. Gathering wood from the wrong section of land could, in some circumstances, result in execution. You layer yourself in your single damp wool tunic, position yourself close to the fading embers, and still wake with a frozen nose, perpetually cold feet, and fingers so stiff they barely bend. Frostbite has no name here. It's simply considered a run of bad luck. Now move forward to summer. That sounds like an improvement, doesn't it? It isn't. In summer, your home transforms into something resembling a clay furnace. There's no airflow, no cooling breeze, and no personal hygiene products of any kind. You sweat through your layers, but removing them isn't an option. Too much exposed skin is socially unacceptable, and it also invites sunburn, insect bites, and community disapproval. The flies arrive in numbers, drawn to your unwashed body and the remnants of last week's goat stew still sitting in the corner. Mosquitoes circle your head while you attempt to sleep, assuming sleep is even possible over the sound of arguing neighbors and crying infants. Out in the fields, the sun presses down on you continuously. No protective cream, no head covering unless you assembled something from straw out of sheer necessity. And the most frustrating part, the work doesn't pause for any of it. Heat exhaustion is referred to casually as taking a bad turn. So you're either shivering in your home through winter, uncertain whether your toes will survive until spring, or sweating your way through summer in your only set of clothing while your body endures the consequences. The one constant throughout all of it, your clothes still irritate your skin, your food is still poor, and there is always more work ahead. Welcome to climate management in the Middle Ages. There isn't any. Feeling thirsty? Looking to rinse your face and clear your head? That's not as straightforward as it sounds. In medieval times, water is not your ally. It is quietly working against you. Start with drinking water. The stream nearby may appear clean and clear, the kind of scene you'd expect in an idealized painting. But the reality is far less appealing. Someone upstream emptied a waste bucket into it not long ago, and if not that, then a deceased animal is likely decomposing somewhere along its path. Parasites, bacteria, and a full spectrum of harmful microorganisms occupy every mouthful of that water. This is precisely why people drank ale instead. Yes, ale, including children. Before that image becomes too alarming, understand that it was what was known as small beer, very low in alcohol content but significantly safer than whatever flowed through the town drainage channel. The brewing process involved boiling, which eliminated much of what made the water dangerous. Wine was available as an alternative for those wealthy enough to access it and unbothered by impaired functioning before midday. What about washing? Surely water served some hygienic purpose? In theory. In practice, largely no. The prevailing belief at the time was that bathing opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. Cleaning yourself was considered medically inadvisable. The layer of accumulated grime on your skin was thought to offer some form of protection. Communal bathhouses did exist, but they developed reputations for being sites of gossip, questionable behavior, and various activities that drew the attention of the church, which moved to close many of them down. Even for those who genuinely wanted to bathe, the process was extensive. Water had to be collected from a well, heated over a fire, transferred into a wooden tub that was likely to leak, and then used before anyone else in the household had the chance to compromise it. Rainwater collected in open barrels was no better, exposed to birds, insects, and organic growth. Whether it's entering your body, being used on your skin, or watering your crops, water in the Middle Ages is less a resource and more a calculated risk. One careless drink could leave you confined to a straw bed for your final days, experiencing symptoms that make you regret every decision that led to that moment. The next time you drink water from a tap without a second thought, consider what that convenience actually represents. Our ancestors had no such certainty. So the water made you ill. Or perhaps something else did. Either way, you need medical attention. Unfortunately, you live in an era where medicine is essentially a combination of philosophical theory, religious interpretation, and well-intentioned harm. Diagnosis begins with the concept of humors. Every ailment, a persistent cough, a skin condition, a broken limb, early symptoms of the plague, is attributed to an imbalance among four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Medieval medical understanding held that health depended on maintaining equilibrium among these four elements, functioning like some form of internal balancing act. Running a fever? The presumed cause is excess blood. The prescribed response is bloodletting, deliberately draining a quantity of blood using a blade or a leech. And in many cases, the person performing this procedure was a barber. A single visit might result in both a haircut and a significant reduction in blood volume. Experiencing prolonged sadness or anxiety? That indicates too much black bile. Treatment options include laxatives, an herbal purge, or extended prayer accompanied by a cold compress, while everyone nearby maintains a cautious distance and begins making quiet preparations. A broken bone or serious wound presents even greater complications. There is no anesthetic unless losing consciousness from pain qualifies. Surgical instruments haven't been cleaned in any meaningful sense. They are heated over flame, not for sanitation purposes, but apparently for effect. Antibiotics are centuries from being discovered, and germ theory hasn't been conceived of yet. The predominant understanding is that illness originates from bad air or from divine displeasure at your moral conduct. A stomach complaint might be attributed to sinful thoughts, with confession recommended alongside treatment. As your condition deteriorates, more leeches are applied, alongside various plant and animal remedies, while a priest positions himself nearby to administer last rites as a precautionary measure. Recovery, if it occurs, is attributed to divine intervention. The practitioner accepts the credit, and the methods are considered validated. In the Middle Ages, medicine is less concerned with healing and more focused on ensuring you survive whatever has been done to treat you. After a full day of hard labor, parasite management, and medical misadventure, you finally return home with the expectation of a decent meal. One reliable comfort to close out the day. Unfortunately, what's waiting for you may pose its own set of risks. Food preservation as a reliable system doesn't exist. There is no refrigeration of any kind, only salt, smoke, and the seasonal cold to slow spoilage. Any meat available has likely been hanging for several days, exposed to insects, treated with questionable brine, and possibly disturbed by rodents. Bread forms the foundation of the medieval diet, but even that carries risks. During years of poor harvest, it gets extended with bark, ground wood, or clay to make limited supplies last longer. And if rye is involved, there's the additional concern of ergot, a fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and in some cases death. The effects have been compared to severe poisoning with neurological consequences. Vegetables are available only within their growing seasons. And one vegetable that is consistently present regardless of season is the turnip, boiled, mashed, or submerged in pottage, which is, as previously established, a perpetually simmering mixture of whatever ingredients were available at any given point in time. Fruit appears in autumn but deteriorates rapidly. Sugar is scarce, expensive, and largely the domain of the wealthy, who use it as a marker of status. Dairy introduces its own complications. Fresh milk spoils within hours. Butter and cheese have better durability but contain bacterial loads that would concern any modern food safety standard. People consume them regardless because the available alternatives are limited. And as for seasoning, spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg carry a value that rivals precious metals. For the average peasant, flavor comes from onions, salt when available, and hardship. Most meals taste like something damp and flavorless, stripped of any real satisfaction. But food isn't only a health concern, it carries political consequences as well. Wild game belongs to the lord of the land, not to you. Being caught taking a rabbit could result in a fine, imprisonment, or execution. Your dinner choice could literally end your life. So as you sit by a dim fire eating your gray stew, understand that every mouthful carries some element of risk. You eat anyway because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't sustain you comfortably, it challenges you at every step. It's now evening. You've worked through the day, endured various forms of suffering, and consumed a meal of questionable safety. You might expect the day to ease up from here. But don't settle in just yet, because in medieval Europe, the evening carries its own obligations. Religion is not simply a component of daily life here. It is the framework around which everything else is organized. The church governs your calendar, your legal system, your access to education if you have any, and the key transitions of your life from birth through death. Consider it a kind of spiritual authority that operates more like a landlord, and you are perpetually behind on your obligations. Each day is marked by prayer bells. The church bell rings in the morning, at midday, and in the evening, not as gentle reminders, but because failing to observe these moments is considered sinful. Neglecting to bow is a sin. Eating meat on a Friday is a sin. An inappropriate thought in a dream, also a sin. And the consequences of accumulated sin are described by clergy in precise, vivid detail. Flames, suffering, and eternal punishment. If the threat of disease doesn't keep you in line, the prospect of damnation will. The Bible is inaccessible to most people because it's written in Latin, a language available only to clergy, monks, and the occasional educated noble. Everything is filtered through the church's interpretation. If a priest attributes your failed harvest to insufficient devotion, your only response is to pray with greater intensity. The tithe, a mandatory contribution of 1/10 of your earnings or produce, is non-negotiable. Grow grain and you hand over grain. Keep chickens and you surrender eggs. Own very little, and you are considered both spiritually and materially deficient. Religious holidays, referred to as holy days, are numerous. While they provide relief from physical labor, they are not occasions for leisure. They are reserved for attending Mass, fasting, confessing, and reflecting on the dangers of personal enjoyment. Challenging the church carries severe consequences. Those accused of heresy are burned. Those branded as witches are drowned. Those who speak out of turn are publicly punished. So you participate, you recite the prayers, you bow at the required moments, and you hold on to the hope that after a life spent in this condition, something better awaits, provided, of course, that you remain in good standing with your local priest. Because in the Middle Ages, divine mercy may be available in theory. The Church's mercy, far less reliably so. If the life of a medieval peasant sounds difficult, consider what it looked like for women. All the same filth, food scarcity, and fear, layered with the demands of childbirth, subservience, and near-total social invisibility. A girl's life trajectory is largely determined from birth. The expected path is to marry young, bear children, serve her husband, and endure until her body gives out. Education is not part of that plan. Unless she belongs to a noble family with access to a convent, her intellectual development effectively ends around the time she learns the basic domestic tasks required of her household. Marriage occurs at a very young age by modern standards. Betrothal at 12 and pregnancy by 14 was not unusual and raised few concerns. The arrangement has nothing to do with personal choice or affection. It's about land, resources, and family alliances. The woman's perspective is not part of the negotiation. Once married, she is legally and socially an extension of her husband's household. Her responsibilities are to produce children, feed the family, manage the home, and do so without complaint. Raising objections risks being labeled difficult, or worse, suspicious, and that particular label could lead to a formal accusation of witchcraft, which carried consequences ranging from drowning to burning, depending on local practice. Childbirth is one of the most dangerous things a medieval woman faces. There is no prenatal care, no reliable sanitation, and no pain relief. Midwives apply what knowledge and skill they have, but complications that would be manageable today are frequently fatal in this era, for the mother, the child, or both. Some women survive many pregnancies. Many do not. And for those who do, the recovery period is not a period at all. It's an immediate return to full domestic and agricultural duties with an infant added to the workload. The expectation is that she continues without pause. An unmarried woman draws suspicion. A widowed woman is exposed and vulnerable. An outspoken woman is considered a threat. Women with knowledge of herbal remedies, a strong disposition, or simply the misfortune of being present near some unexplained event could find themselves accused of witchcraft. Even within the church, women's roles are tightly confined. Nuns operated under strict regulations, restricted speech, limited movement, and a spiritual standing that was consistently ranked beneath that of men. In the Middle Ages, women were expected to endure, comply, produce, and remain quiet, and to do all of it with apparent composure, as though suffering with dignity was its own form of virtue. You've now navigated the filth, the food scarcity, the social inequality, and the general misery of medieval existence. But there is one more element to address: violence. Pervasive, brutal, and largely accepted as a normal feature of daily life. The Middle Ages were not peaceful. The closest thing to law and order was the unpredictable temperament of whoever held local authority. Violence exists in homes, in public spaces, on battlefields, in religious disputes, and in the most mundane shared spaces. Crime is frequent. Punishment is severe and public. Justice functions more as a demonstration of power than a system of protection. Steal bread and you may lose a hand. Be accused of dishonesty and face physical mutilation. Speak too freely and be subjected to a humiliating restraint device designed for public correction. If a serious accusation is leveled against you, heresy, theft, witchcraft, the path to proving your innocence runs directly through physical suffering. Trial by ordeal was a genuine legal process. One version required you to submerge your hand in boiling water to retrieve an object. If the wound healed cleanly within 3 days, you were declared innocent. If not, you were found guilty. Another method involved being thrown into water. Sinking indicated innocence, though likely at the cost of your life, while floating indicated guilt and brought its own consequences. The system was designed in a way that made an unfavorable outcome nearly inevitable. Executions are public events, attended by crowds, sometimes treated as entertainment. Hangings, beheadings, and burnings draw audiences the way public spectacles always have throughout history. Domestic violence is not only permitted but in some contexts expected. Husbands hold recognized authority to physically discipline their wives and children. Confrontations in public spaces are commonplace. Crossing paths with a member of the nobility in the wrong way could result in an immediate physical response. And conflict at a larger scale is always present somewhere. Regional disputes, territorial ambitions, religious campaigns. There is always a war somewhere, and someone is always being conscripted into it. Violence in the Middle Ages is not a symptom of social breakdown. It is a structural feature of how society functions. Everyone lives with the awareness that life can end abruptly, that justice is inconsistently applied, and that personal safety is never guaranteed. Keep your head down, move carefully, and maintain a healthy wariness of those around you. You've made it through the parasites, the inadequate medical care, the relentless labor, and the ever-present threat of public punishment. Now comes the final chapter that awaited most people in medieval times. An early death, arrived at without ceremony or comfort. Reaching the age of 40 makes you a remarkable outlier. You might be referred to informally as the Old One, which sounds like a title of respect but is really just an acknowledgement that you've defied the statistical odds by a considerable margin. Let's look at the numbers. Average life expectancy sits somewhere between 30 and 40 years, though that figure is significantly pulled downward by the rate of infant death. Close to half of all children did not survive past the age of 5. A single illness, prolonged malnutrition, or one particularly harsh winter was enough. No vaccines, no antibiotics, and no reliable medical intervention of any kind. If you did make it through childhood, you entered adulthood already worn down. Labor began as soon as you were physically capable, and by your mid-20s, your body showed the wear of someone twice your age. Missing teeth, missing fingers, and a general absence of the optimism you may have started with. For women, the most consistent and lethal danger was childbirth, one of the leading causes of female death in this era. No pain relief, no medical procedure to manage complications, just prayer, heated water, and the presence of whoever was available while the worst unfolded. For men, the threats took different forms but were no less constant. Agricultural accidents, infections developing from wounds that would be minor by modern standards, interpersonal violence, military campaigns that went badly. Even a routine trip to the market carried risk if you encountered a desperate criminal or a hostile official. Death also arrived in larger, more sweeping forms. The plague could reduce a populated town to a cemetery within weeks. Famine could stretch across entire seasons, gradually hollowing out villages. And sometimes it was simply bad luck, contaminated grain leading to a final night of fever and confusion. As for burial, you were fortunate if you received one. Bodies were interred quickly to contain disease. No embalming, no formal preparation, no polished casket, just a hole in the ground, a few murmured words, and a modest mound of soil, assuming space remained in the churchyard. Life in medieval times was relentless, brief, and constantly encroached upon by death in its most ordinary forms. There was no retirement. People simply stopped at some point, and that was the end of it. So, how has your day been? You woke up surrounded by filth, used a bucket for your morning needs, attempted something resembling dental hygiene, came close to passing out from hunger, labored until your body protested in every way it knew how, spent the day itching through rough fabric, prayed to avoid disease, and narrowly avoided serious legal consequences over something trivial. That is a single day in medieval Europe. The romanticized image of the Middle Ages, honorable knights, elegant women in towers, heroic battles, and grand feasts in candlelit halls, is a constructed fantasy, refined over centuries by literature and popular storytelling. The actual medieval world was physically demanding, often cruel, and structured around a hierarchy that offered very little flexibility. If you were born into poverty, you remained there. If you were born into wealth, your odds of survival improved, but you were still vulnerable to illness, political instability, and the kind of minor injury that, without proper treatment, could become fatal. Even nobility came with its own category of misery. Stone castles were cold, smoky, and infested. A fur cloak and a cup of wine didn't change the fact that a minor skirmish or an infected wound could end everything. The so-called simpler times were not simpler. They were more demanding in almost every respect. Every task took longer to complete, every physical ailment carried greater consequence, and every ordinary activity from childbirth to eating a meal came with a set of risks that modern life has largely eliminated. Existence was oriented almost entirely around survival. Quiet moments for personal reflection or imagination existed, but they led nowhere in practical terms. There was no mechanism for social advancement, no access to modern healthcare, and no way to look up an answer to an unfamiliar problem. Most people lived their entire lives within a very short distance of where they were born. And yet, through all of it, people still found ways to laugh, compose songs, tell stories, fall in love, and build meaning within the constraints of their circumstances. Not because life was manageable, but because human beings have a persistent tendency to find light even within the most difficult conditions. So tonight, as you settle into a comfortable bed with access to clean water, reliable medicine, and a temperature-controlled room, that's worth a moment of quiet acknowledgement, both for what the modern world provides and for the generations of people who endured everything it took to get here. Long before she was known as Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, architect of sweeping reform, and one of history's most consequential rulers, she was a girl named Sophie. Born Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, she came from a modest German princely family whose small territory in Pomerania carried little real influence. But Sophie herself possessed something that could not be inherited or purchased: a sharp and disciplined intellect, a natural ability to connect with people, and a quietly determined ambition that would define everything that followed. Her upbringing provided an early education in navigating difficult personalities. Her mother, Johanna, was calculating and socially driven, focused primarily on advancing the family's standing. Her father, a Prussian military officer, was largely removed from her daily life. From an early age, Sophie developed the ability to balance compliance with careful observation. She read widely, became fluent in multiple languages, and cultivated the habit of understanding a room before contributing to it, skills that would later become essential tools for survival in one of Europe's most politically treacherous courts. When Empress Elizabeth Petrovna of Russia began searching for a bride for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, she looked to German nobility. Peter was himself of German background, and Empress Elizabeth believed a foreign bride, grateful for the opportunity and malleable enough to manage, would suit her purposes. Sophie aligned with that profile: noble lineage, a Lutheran upbringing she would be required to abandon, and a reputation for both poise and apparent humility. At 14 years old, she was summoned to Russia. She arrived in St. Petersburg in the winter of 1744, dressed in clothing suited to the German climate and carrying the composed expression expected of her. Her mother guided her forward as part of a broader political calculation. Sophie, however, had her own understanding of the situation. To establish herself within Russian society, she converted to Orthodox Christianity, taking the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. The conversion was a public event with significant personal consequences. She was not simply changing religious affiliation, she was permanently severing her connection to her previous life and committing herself entirely to a foreign court with no path of return. No observer watching that composed teenage girl could have anticipated what her presence in that court would eventually set in motion: power shifts, political upheaval, and an era-defining reign. But from the moment she arrived, she had stopped being a passive figure in someone else's plan and begun working towards something of her own. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was designed to secure her position within the Russian imperial family. In practice, it functioned more as a form of confinement than a foundation for partnership. Peter, the designated heir to the Russian throne, bore little resemblance to the capable ruler his position required. Socially awkward, emotionally immature, and fixated on toy soldiers and military games, he showed minimal interest in governance or in his marriage. Historical accounts indicate that he declined to consummate the marriage for a number of years. He held a deep admiration for Frederick the Great of Prussia and maintained a persistent resentment toward the Russian court and the role it had assigned him. Catherine's approach was the opposite. She committed herself to understanding Russia, its language, its history, its religious practices. Peter sought distance from his circumstances. Catherine worked to embed herself within them. This wasn't simply a personal incompatibility. It had direct political implications. The Russian imperial court operated as a dense network of suspicion, competing interests, and shifting alliances. Empress Elizabeth retained absolute authority, but her health was visibly declining, and everyone in the court was already positioning themselves for what came next. Catherine existed within this environment under constant surveillance. Her correspondence was intercepted, her relationships were monitored, and her conduct was scrutinized at every level. Her husband offered no protection, her mother continued to operate in the court's political undercurrents on behalf of foreign interests, and even her household staff could not be fully trusted. In that context, an alliance established one day could become a liability the next. Catherine understood the rules of this environment clearly and chose to operate within them carefully, building relationships and influence through patience rather than visibility. She cultivated relationships with military officers, built connections with scholars, and established a reputation for composure and restraint, a deliberate contrast to her husband's erratic behavior and his open disregard for Russian customs. In private, Catherine was reading the works of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu. While the court viewed her as a young consort of limited significance, she was constructing a framework, not only for her own future, but for Russia's, built around strength, education, and rational governance. There was, however, a fundamental obstacle. As long as Peter remained alive, Catherine remained effectively powerless, confined to a role with no real authority. So she waited, paid careful attention to everything around her, and continued planning. She had concluded that the Russian throne would not simply pass to her. It would need to be claimed. In 1762, after nearly 2 decades of waiting and quiet strategic positioning, Catherine identified her moment and moved with striking precision. Empress Elizabeth had died, and Peter, now Peter III, had finally assumed the throne. His reign, however, began falling apart almost from the first week. Within a matter of months, Peter had managed to alienate the Orthodox Church, offend the nobility, antagonize the military leadership, and publicly express admiration for Prussia, a nation that Russia had been in direct conflict with. He reversed established policies, treated the clergy with contempt, and made little effort to conceal his intention to divorce Catherine and remarry. The court, which had already been skeptical of his judgment, grew increasingly hostile. Military officers with long-standing loyalty to Catherine began expressing their dissatisfaction. Even among ordinary Russians, deeply religious and proud of their national identity, Peter was seen as a foreign-influenced figure who showed no respect for their traditions. Catherine had been watching all of it. In July of that year, while Peter was at his summer residence, she launched a coup. With the backing of key military figures, including her companion Gregory Orlov and his influential brothers, she moved through St. Petersburg in full imperial dress, was proclaimed Empress Catherine II, and secured the allegiance of the imperial guard. Peter, without allies and unprepared for what had happened, surrendered within days. He was taken into custody and shortly afterward was reported dead. The official explanation was a digestive ailment. The unofficial understanding was that it was not a natural death. Catherine was now empress, not through birthright, not through marriage, but through calculated determination and the willingness to act when others hesitated. It was a genuinely unprecedented development. A woman born outside Russia, with no direct claim to the throne, had taken it without military conflict. But the harder challenge was just beginning. Seizing power was one thing. Establishing the legitimacy and longevity of that power was another. Would Russia accept her leadership? Would the nobility extend her genuine respect? Could she hold the empire together without falling to the same fate she had just engineered for her husband? Catherine understood clearly that power obtained through political maneuvering could be removed just as easily. She needed to govern not as someone who had taken something, but as someone who had earned it. And so her transition began, from calculated political operator to reforming ruler, one who would expand borders, engage seriously with Enlightenment thought, and fundamentally alter what it meant for a woman to hold power at the highest level. Once Catherine held the crown, she could have focused simply on maintaining what she had. She chose a more ambitious course. She intended to reshape Russia, not only in military and political terms, but intellectually and institutionally. Where her husband had admired military spectacle and foreign generals, Catherine was drawn to the thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in the application of reason to governance, in the expansion of education, and in the idea that a ruler carried a genuine responsibility toward the people being governed, even while exercising absolute authority. Catherine didn't simply engage with Enlightenment philosophy as an intellectual exercise. She applied it actively. She maintained a correspondence with Voltaire that extended over 15 years, engaging in dialogue while also defending her own model of autocratic rule. She invited Denis Diderot to her court and acquired his personal library as a means of providing him financial support. In her private hours, she worked through legal texts, considered policy reforms, and developed plans to bring the empire's systems in line with more modern principles. Her early years of rule included serious efforts to reform Russian law. She established the Legislative Commission in 1767, an ambitious undertaking aimed at producing an entirely new legal framework for Russia. Her own document for this commission, known as the Nakaz or Instruction, read in many ways like a political philosophy text, addressing concepts such as legal equality, the problems with torture as a judicial tool, and the obligations of rulers to those they governed. For an 18th-century Russian empress operating within an autocratic system, these were genuinely progressive positions. But Enlightenment ideals had to contend with the reality of Russian society, a vast, feudal, and deeply traditional land where the nobility held firm expectations about their relationship to the serfs beneath them. Catherine was fully aware of this. While she pursued reform in certain areas, limiting some uses of torture, expanding secular education, funding the construction of schools and libraries, she also reinforced the nobility's authority over their serfs when it served the purpose of maintaining their loyalty. This was Catherine's defining tension as a ruler. In public discourse she presented as a philosopher queen, In practical governance, she was a pragmatic autocrat. She operated between the intellectual world of French salon culture and the uncompromising political landscape of Russia. Her vision for the country was ambitious but always anchored in what was achievable. She was not trying to make Russia imitate Western Europe. She was trying to build a modern Russia on her own terms, and that meant pursuing reform while retaining the firm control required to survive. Catherine was not satisfied with reshaping Russia from within. She wanted to extend it outward, to build an empire that commanded genuine respect and carried real strategic weight on the world stage. Where Peter the Great had created an opening toward the West, Catherine aimed to remove the barriers entirely. Under her leadership, Russia's territorial reach expanded further than it had under any previous ruler. She pursued military campaigns not merely to protect what Russia already held, but to redraw the boundaries of European power. Among the most consequential of these was her series of wars against the Ottoman Empire, fought through the 1760s and into the 1770s. These were not simply territorial conflicts. They were about strategic positioning and influence. Catherine framed herself as the defender of Orthodox Christian communities living under Ottoman rule, and as the legitimate protector of Eastern Europe. Through campaigns led by generals including Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Potemkin, Russia secured significant gains, including Crimea, the northern Black Sea coastline, and access to warm water ports that Russian rulers had long sought. These were not only military achievements. They carried symbolic weight. Each expansion signaled that Russia had moved beyond the margins of European affairs and had become a central force within them. Catherine also directed her attention westward. Through a series of diplomatic arrangements and territorial agreements, she took part in the partitions of Poland, dividing the weakened Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with Austria and Prussia. By the time the Third Partition was completed in 1795, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent state, and Russia had absorbed substantial new lands along with millions of additional subjects. But Catherine's expansion was not conducted solely through military force. New cities were established, trade networks were extended, and foreign settlers, including communities of Germans, were brought in to develop Russian agricultural land. The empire grew into a geographically and culturally diverse expanse, stretching from the Baltic in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Throughout all of it, Catherine remained directly engaged, reviewing reports, issuing directives, and personally shaping the direction of the empire's growth. Critics characterized this as imperialism driven by personal ambition. Catherine's own view was different. She regarded expansion as a natural expression of strong leadership and measured a ruler's significance in part by the scale and security of the territory they governed. Her aim was not merely to rule Russia, but to establish it as a civilization that its rivals would take seriously, feared where necessary, respected universally, and unified under her authority. For all that defined Catherine's public legacy, her governance, her reforms, her military campaigns, her private life attracted an equal measure of attention, much of it centered on her relationships. Catherine had a series of companions throughout her reign, often considerably younger than herself, frequently attractive, and in a number of cases politically significant. She made no effort to conceal these relationships. On the contrary, those who conducted themselves appropriately often received formal recognition in return, titles, properties, and financial settlements at the conclusion of the relationship. Those who did not conduct themselves appropriately were quietly removed from her circle, sometimes with a formal acknowledgement and an administrative reassignment that served as a dignified exit. Among the most significant of these relationships was her connection with Gregory Potemkin, a figure of exceptional intellect and considerable boldness. Their relationship existed somewhere between personal partnership, political alliance, and genuine collaboration. Some historians have put forward the theory that the two may have entered into a secret marriage. Together, they directed military operations, oversaw colonization efforts, and drove the development of Russia's southern territories. Potemkin was not simply a personal companion. In many respects, he functioned as a co-architect of her reign. European courts, however, were unable to move past the optics. Gossip circulated widely. Satirical publications depicted Catherine in unflattering terms, framing her as reckless and morally unrestrained. After her death, the rumors intensified further, eventually producing the most well-known and entirely fabricated story, a crude invention spread by political opponents to damage her historical reputation. The reason for this obsession is not difficult to understand. Catherine was a woman who exercised power without apology in an era that expected female rulers to conform to one of two narrow archetypes: the saintly figure of moral purity or the tragic figure brought down by circumstance. She rejected both completely. She governed, maintained personal relationships, and made her own choices on her own terms, and that refusal to conform was genuinely threatening to those invested in the existing order. It is worth noting that Catherine herself held a considered philosophical perspective on personal relationships and human desire. She regarded pleasure as a natural dimension of life, not something incompatible with the responsibilities of rulership. She maintained a clear separation between her private life and the functioning of the state, something that many male rulers of the same era failed to achieve. Her relationships were frequently strategic in nature. The men in her personal circle tended to be loyal, capable, and useful to her governance. When they ceased to be, she concluded the relationship in a manner that was typically controlled and financially generous. Catherine's private life did not compromise her authority. It was, in many ways, an extension of the same deliberate thinking she applied to everything else, a combination of genuine feeling and practical calculation that contributed to both her enduring reputation and the level of unease she inspired in her contemporaries. For all her political skill and institutional control, Catherine's reign included a moment of genuine crisis. In 1773, that crisis arrived in the form of a Cossack leader named Yemelian Pugachev. He was not a conventional dissident. Pugachev claimed to be Peter III himself, Catherine's deceased husband, asserting that he had survived the coup and had returned to reclaim the throne from what he characterized as a foreign usurper. The claim was without foundation. Peter was dead. But among Russia's most marginalized and exhausted populations, the factual accuracy of the claim was largely beside the point. What it offered was something more valuable in that moment: the possibility of change. Pugachev promised an end to serfdom, relief from taxation, and the redistribution of land to ordinary people. His message spread quickly through the Volga River region, drawing support from Cossacks, peasants, and Old Believers, communities that had experienced the widening gap between the nobility and those beneath them as a daily reality. The rebellion that followed became the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Settlements were seized, fortified positions fell, and members of the nobility were killed. For a period, there was a genuine question about whether the empire's internal structure could withstand the pressure. Catherine was unsettled by what unfolded. This was not an external military threat she could address through conventional strategy. This was a revolt originating from within her own population, directed at the very system she had built her authority upon. She responded decisively. Professional military forces were deployed and moved to suppress the rebellion with force. By 1774, Pugachev's movement had been broken. He was captured, transported in an iron cage, and publicly executed in Moscow, a deliberate signal to anyone who might consider a similar path. In the aftermath, Catherine's governing approach shifted noticeably. Her earlier inclinations towards serf liberation receded and were not revisited. The rebellion had exposed a fundamental tension, that Enlightenment-influenced governance and a feudal social structure could not coexist indefinitely. She responded by drawing closer to the nobility, reinforcing their authority over the serfs in exchange for their continued loyalty and support. This was a defining turning point in her reign. The empress who had once cited Voltaire in her policy documents now placed stability above ideological consistency. Reform continued, but within more carefully managed boundaries. Dissent was monitored and contained. Pugachev lost his life, but what he represented, the instability embedded in a society built on deep inequality, remained a concern Catherine never fully resolved. By the time Catherine approached the final years of her life, she had governed Russia for more than 3 decades, a longer continuous reign than any other woman in Russian history. From the moment she assumed power, she had exceeded what was expected of her, restructured the empire's reach, and redefined what both a woman and a monarch were capable of achieving. Under her leadership, Russia established itself as a genuine European power. Its territory grew by more than 200,000 square miles, incorporating Crimea, significant portions of Poland, and the northern Black Sea coastline. These were not simply military achievements, they were strategic gains that secured vital warm-water ports and restructured the empire's position in regional trade. But her impact extended well beyond territorial maps. Catherine helped establish the Hermitage Museum, built one of the most significant art collections anywhere in Europe, and maintained active intellectual exchange with leading figures of the Enlightenment. Her court became a recognized center of culture, artistic patronage, and serious intellectual engagement. In a country that Western Europeans frequently regarded as peripheral, Catherine placed Russia at the center of the cultural conversation. She worked to expand educational access, including founding schools for girls, supported the wider distribution of printed material, and introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia, choosing to receive the vaccine publicly herself, a deliberate demonstration of confidence in the science at a time when such confidence was far from universal. Her reign was also defined by internal contradictions that history has not overlooked. While she engaged deeply with Enlightenment thought and spoke of reform and progress, serfdom was never abolished under her rule. It was in fact extended further into newly acquired territories. Her reforms, though meaningful in several areas, operated primarily from the top down, designed to improve the empire's functioning and international standing without fundamentally restructuring the social order that sustained it. Nevertheless, what Catherine delivered across her reign was stability, ambition, and a coherent vision for Russia's place in the world. She understood that power was not something passively held. It had to be actively constructed, carefully maintained, and consistently defended. She did not govern by inherited divine right. She governed through political intelligence, strategic foresight, and disciplined execution. She has been described in many terms across the centuries, as self-serving, as authoritarian, as a reformer, and as a calculating operator. But above all assessments, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was larger, wealthier, and more consequential in global affairs than it had been for generations. She left a secured throne, an expanded empire, and a historical presence that continues to be examined and debated. Catherine did not merely occupy the role of empress. She defined it through intellect, strategy, and an unflinching hold on the direction of her empire. In doing so, she became something beyond a historical figure. She became a defining story. For all her power, her territorial conquests, and her enduring place in history, Catherine the Great was at her foundation a woman navigating structures built entirely around male authority and methodically reshaping those structures to reflect her own vision. Behind the formal portraits and imperial proclamations was someone acutely aware of how fragile her position actually was. She was not born Russian. She came to the throne through a coup. She governed an empire in which female leadership was viewed with deep skepticism. And yet she did not merely survive those conditions, she built something lasting within them. Catherine was not a passive holder of power. She read continuously, wrote at length, and remained intellectually engaged throughout her life. Her daily routine was demanding, reviewing official reports, conducting correspondence with foreign governments, revising state documents, and managing a court composed of competing interests and rival factions. The throne was not something she sat upon. It was something she worked from, with the discipline and focus of someone who had never taken their position for granted. There was also a dimension of isolation that ran through her reign. She was surrounded by courtiers, companions, and creative figures, yet her own memoirs reflect on how rarely she encountered people she could genuinely trust. Her son Paul, whom she regarded with deep unease and deliberately kept removed from state responsibilities, developed into someone she believed would reverse much of what she had built. Her most significant emotional partnership, with Gregory Potemkin, eventually settled into a lasting friendship, but his death in 1791 left a loss she never fully moved past. Catherine managed her public image with the same deliberateness she brought to governance. She understood that how a ruler was perceived was inseparable from the authority they held, and she navigated that understanding with greater sophistication than most of her contemporaries. She presented herself as a maternal figure to Russia, as an enlightened sovereign, as a military leader, as a patron of the arts, and she sustained all of those identities simultaneously. Beneath each of them was a woman who had faced rejection, betrayal, public scandal, and internal rebellion, and had continued forward through all of it. When she died in 1796, she left behind an empire that had been transformed, but also many unanswered questions. Could she have done more to end serfdom? Were her Enlightenment ideals weakened by political reality? Was she more of a reformer or simply a ruler? History remembers her by the title she never claimed for herself, the Great. It was not because she was flawless, gentle, or perfectly fair. It was because she seized power and used it on her own terms in an age and society where women were not expected to hold any authority. She did not simply wear the crown. She changed what it meant to earn one. In the humid heart of the Chiapas jungle in southern Mexico, the ruins of Palenque quietly preserve stories from the ancient Maya world. Towering temples rise above the trees, their limestone surfaces worn by time, yet still full of secrets. And in 1994, one of those secrets came to light. A team of Mexican archaeologists led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez was surveying Temple 13, a relatively modest pyramid beside the more famous Temple of the Inscriptions, the burial site of the powerful King Pacal the Great. Temple 13 was not expected to contain much, until researchers noticed something unusual, a sealed hidden chamber beneath the structure. No looters had entered it. It remained untouched. When the archaeologists opened the passage and descended inside, they discovered a stone sarcophagus resting in silence. The air felt heavy with centuries of history. As they lifted the lid, red dust rose into the air, bright and striking. The interior was coated in powdered cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide used in Maya ceremony. Inside that crimson layer lay the skeleton of a woman. She had been buried with care and respect. Her bones were delicate but preserved, her skull still covered by a jade mask, and her body surrounded by funerary offerings, necklaces, diadems, ear spools, all crafted from jade and shell. Everything about the burial suggested royalty. Yet no name appeared. No glyphs identified her. It was one of the richest female burials ever discovered in Mesoamerica, and yet it remained a mystery. Why was she buried in red powder? Who was she? Was she a queen, a priestess, or perhaps Pacal's wife? Researchers named her the Red Queen, and the title remained. Even with modern forensic study, they could not identify her with certainty. They only confirmed that she had lived around the 7th century, during the golden age of Palenque. Unlike most Maya tombs, hers had been hidden, untouched, and deliberately isolated. Her burial was not only ceremonial, it was spiritual. This woman was not meant to be remembered through words. She was meant to be remembered through ritual, through color, and through the mystery she left behind. The most striking feature of the Red Queen's tomb was not her jade jewelry or the silence of the sealed chamber. It was the red dust. A thick layer of powdered cinnabar covered everything, the sarcophagus, the walls, her bones, and even the offerings nearby. It clung to stone like blood. To the Maya, this was no accident. Cinnabar, made from crushed mercury sulfide, was one of the most sacred and dangerous materials in the ancient world. Its vivid red color was not only visually powerful. It symbolized blood, rebirth, and the life force connecting the human and divine worlds. Red was sacred. It was the color of sunrise, sacrifice, and life emerging from death. And it was more than symbolism. It held spiritual meaning. Covering the dead in cinnabar was a ritual intended to transform the body, preserving it not for eternity, but for passage. In Maya belief, death was not an ending. It was a crossing into another cosmic realm. The Red Queen, whoever she was being prepared not simply for burial, but for deification. There was another side to this practice. Cinnabar is toxic. Repeated exposure can cause mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, and death. The Maya likely did not understand the chemistry, but they understood its power. It was unstable, potent, and dangerous. To cover a body in it was to declare that this person was no ordinary mortal. At Palenque, very few individuals were buried with cinnabar. Pakal the Great, the king whose pyramid dominates the site, was one of them. His body, like hers, had also been covered in the same red powder. That detail immediately raised speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or someone of equal sacred status? Her skull had been placed on a layer of jaguar skin, another important symbol. Around her were bone needles, obsidian blades, and miniature jade figurines, suggesting rituals performed either during her life or in honor of her death. Every part of the burial communicated a message without words. A story of authority hidden in secrecy. A woman prepared to enter the underworld through ceremony, surrounded by the color of sacrifice. Around the Red Queen's remains was a silent world marked by jade, shell, and obsidian. These were not simple decorations. They were offerings, each carefully selected to accompany her into the Maya afterlife, Xibalba. At her sides were jade necklaces, heavy and cool, their polished surfaces still bright after 13 centuries underground. Jade was not only beautiful, it was sacred. The Maya saw it as a symbol of eternal life. It represented the green of maize, the strength of the jungle, and the breath of the gods. Only elites were buried with jade. For the Red Queen, it covered her chest, wrists, and ears, a clear sign that in life she held influence, perhaps even divine favor. One of the most memorable objects was the jade funerary mask placed gently over her face. Unlike the golden death masks of Egypt, this one was subtle, made from dozens of tiny mosaic tiles shaped to follow the outline of her skull. The mask had ritual purpose, to protect the soul, preserve identity, and present her as sacred before the gods. Near her bones were bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell objects. These may have been ritual tools or symbols of her role as priestess, healer, or royal matriarch. One bone pin carried faint engraving, small but meaningful. It was a distant trace of a voice now lost to time. At her feet and along the tomb's edges were ceramic vessels, still sealed, likely once filled with offerings such as food, drink, or incense to support her spirit beyond death. The Maya believed the afterlife was a difficult journey, layered with trials and danger. These objects were not luxuries. They were necessities. To modern eyes, the tomb feels intimate rather than excessive. It was not filled with gold, chariots, or spectacle. Instead, it held objects chosen for spiritual meaning. It was a map for the soul. Through these treasures, we see how the Maya understood death, not as finality, but as a transfer of power. The Red Queen was not buried to disappear. She was being prepared to rise. For all the richness of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind one major absence: no name. No inscription decorated her sarcophagus. No glyphs on the walls identified her. She was clearly someone important. But who was she? From the moment the tomb was opened, scholars began searching for answers. The strongest theory is that the Red Queen was Tiziakbu Ajah, the wife of Kinich Janub, Pakal, known today as Pakal the Great, the most famous ruler of Palenque. Tiziakbu Ajah was more than Pakal's consort. She was born into nobility and married into Palenque's royal dynasty at a young age. She bore at least 3 sons, all of whom held high rank, and she played an important ceremonial role during her husband's reign. If anyone could be buried with such honor, it was her. Supporting this idea was the tomb's location, only a few feet away from Pakal's own grand burial in the Temple of the Inscriptions. The closeness suggests a deliberate pairing, husband and wife, rulers even in death. And then there is the cinnabar. Only 2 burials in Palenque were found with such heavy cinnabar coverage: Pakal and the Red Queen. It is unlikely this was accidental. But this is where the mystery grows deeper. DNA tests were carried out on both sets of remains in hopes of confirming the connection. Yet the results were inconclusive. The woman's bones showed no direct maternal link to Pakal. But that did not rule out a spousal relationship. After all, marriage does not require shared blood. Some scholars have argued she could have been Sak Kuk, Pakal's powerful mother who ruled Palenque before he came of age. Others suggest she may have been a high priestess, a sister, or a royal ancestor whose name has simply been lost through time. Still, the evidence points most strongly to Tiziakbu Ajah, a queen by title, a mother of kings, and a spiritual counterpart to Pakal. The lack of a name may not be an oversight. It may have been intentional. In Maya cosmology, the soul lived on not through monuments, but through ritual, symbol, and the whispers of the earth. And so, the Red Queen remains suspended between legend and truth. A woman who ruled, remembered not in stone, but in scarlet and silence. To understand the Red Queen, we must understand the world she came from. A world where Maya women, especially royal women, held more influence than many realize. In Maya civilization, politics was often a family matter. Royal women were not merely passive consorts. They were diplomats, priestesses, and power brokers. They conducted rituals, sponsored temples, and played major roles in maintaining dynastic legitimacy. Their bloodlines were political capital, used to build alliances and secure claims to the throne. Take Sak Cook, for example, the mother of Pakal the Great. When the throne of Palenque was left vacant, she took power herself and ruled as queen regent until her son came of age. She was not a placeholder. She was a ruler in her own right, issuing decrees and overseeing construction projects. Without her, Pakal may never have risen at all. And she was not an exception. Across the Maya world, in places like Yaxcalan, Naranjo, and Calakmul, inscriptions show women performing major ceremonies, engaging in diplomatic affairs, and sometimes ruling directly. They were often portrayed in stele and murals, dressed in elaborate headdresses and regalia, standing beside kings as equals, or sometimes above them. Their words were carved in glyphs. Their names were remembered until they were not. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, much of that memory had faded. The colonial lens saw native women as silent figures in a male-dominated world. But archaeology tells a different story, one of complex gender roles where power was negotiated, not simply inherited. This context places the Red Queen in a new light. She may not have ruled in name, but her burial, rich, sacred, and positioned beside Pakal, suggests she was a central pillar in the royal order. Her jade mask was not just decoration. It was a symbol of identity, of authority held in life and protected in death. Her bloodline may have been the very force that held Palenque's dynasty together. In Maya civilization, a queen was not just a queen. She was a keeper of sacred lineage, a voice in ceremony, and often the bridge between gods and men. The Red Queen may be nameless, but in her world she was never voiceless. The Red Queen was not only buried with treasures. She was buried within architecture rich with purpose, layered with Maya cosmology, ritual symbolism, and intentional design. Her tomb was not merely a grave. It was a gateway to eternity. Her body was discovered inside Temple 13, one of the smaller pyramids within the heart of Palenque. Yet its closeness to the Temple of the Inscriptions, the resting place of Pakal the Great, is revealing. These temples were not built randomly. Their placement was sacred, guided by astronomy, myth, and dynastic memory. Temple 13 rises modestly compared to its grand neighbor. But it hides something even more personal, a sealed crypt untouched by looters, perfectly preserved. It was constructed deep within the temple's core, accessible only by a steep, narrow staircase. The descent into her tomb feels symbolic, a ritual journey downward into the underworld. The chamber itself is stark, made of cut stone, sealed tightly for over 1,300 years. No glyphs or murals cover the walls. No ornate carvings tell her story. But perhaps that silence was intentional. This was a space not for the living to interpret, but for the dead to transform. At the center, her sarcophagus rests like an altar crafted from limestone. It echoes the grand stone coffin of Pakal next door. While Pakal's lid is famously engraved with scenes of cosmic rebirth, the Red Queen's tomb is more restrained. The focus is inward, on the body, on the cinnabar, on the ritual of death itself. And yet, there are subtle architectural signs that hint at meaning. The tomb is aligned east to west, a symbolic path reflecting the sun's journey from life to death. The chamber is small but powerful. It feels deliberate, personal, a sacred enclosure for someone deeply honored. Maya temples were cosmological tools, bridges between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. To be buried in one was to be raised beyond the human realm. The Red Queen's eternal home was not an afterthought. It was a carefully built shrine, a place where death became transformation. Her bones rest in stone, her essence in cinnabar, and her legacy in the architecture itself. A temple that speaks without words, telling us she mattered. To the ancient Maya, death was not the end. It was a threshold, a sacred passage into the underworld known as Xibalba. And for someone like the Red Queen, this crossing was not only spiritual. It was political, cosmological, and deeply ritualized. Burial rituals were carefully arranged events rooted in myth and meant to guide the soul through the dangerous layers of the underworld. Maya texts and iconography tell us that Xibalba was no peaceful afterlife. It was a maze of darkness, rivers of blood, trials, and gods of death. Only those properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped could complete the journey successfully. The Red Queen was buried wrapped in cinnabar, enclosed in stone, and surrounded by offerings. All signs of an elite burial. But there is more. The presence of bone needles and obsidian blades in her tomb hint at auto-sacrifice rituals, possibly symbolic tools representing rites she had performed in life or that were repeated at her burial to empower her spirit. Hirari mask, carefully assembled from jade tiles, was not simply decorative. It may have served as a spiritual vessel, preserving her face and identity as she traveled into the afterlife. In Maya belief, the face was a mirror of the soul, and the soul needed to be recognized by the gods. The ceramic vessels surrounding her may once have held chocolate, maize, water, or even pulque to nourish her in the next world. Other items like stingray spines or shell trumpets may have served as spiritual instruments, calls to the gods, or symbols of sacred communication. Burial was not simply a farewell. It was a transformation. The Maya believed in cycles, death as a seed, burial as planting, and the afterlife as rebirth. Kings and queens were often viewed as earthly forms of gods. In death, they returned to those divine beginnings. The Red Queen, covered in the color of blood, placed inside a pyramid and honored with offerings, was being prepared for rebirth, not as a mortal, but as a figure connected to the sacred order of the cosmos. Her burial was not the end of her story. It was the start of her legend. Only steps away from the Red Queen's final resting place stands one of the most famous tombs in Mesoamerica, that of Kinich Janab Pakal, known simply as Pakal the Great. His burial inside the Grand Temple of the Inscriptions is celebrated for its artistry, size, and deep spiritual meaning. But what makes the Red Queen's tomb so remarkable is not only what it contained, but where it was discovered. Her sarcophagus was hidden inside Temple 3, directly beside Pakal's monument. In a city like Palenque, where every temple was carefully placed to reflect cosmic beliefs, this closeness was no accident. It was deliberate, a message carved in stone. Many scholars believe the Red Queen was Tiziakbu Ajah, Pakal's queen and trusted companion. While her tomb carries no inscriptions, the similarities between their burials are striking. Both were covered in cinnabar, both placed inside pyramids, both buried with jade, and both honored with great respect. These rituals reflect each other, like two parts of one sacred story. Pakal's tomb lit famously shows him descending into the underworld tree, a cosmic image of death and rebirth. The Red Queen's simpler tomb holds no such carvings, but the meaning may lie in their pairing. If Pakal represented the sun, traveling through the underworld each night before rising again, then the Red Queen may have symbolized the moon, the feminine force following its own mysterious path across the sky. Together they represented a cosmic balance, masculine and feminine, king and queen, sun and moon, order and ritual. In Maya belief, rulership was never singular. It was relational. Harmony in the universe required balance, and that balance reached into royal life as well. By placing the Red Queen beside Pakal, the Maya preserved not only a marriage, but a sacred partnership. Their closeness in death may have reflected their roles in life. A queen not behind her king, but beside him, sharing not only a throne, but a legacy. In their tombs, they speak without words. Two souls wrapped in cinnabar and stone, joined across eternity. One of history's most sacred silences. Though her name was lost to time, the Red Queen of Palenque survives not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the most mysterious and powerful women of the ancient world. Her tomb, sealed for more than 1,300 years, now speaks across centuries, raising questions that grow louder with each discovery. She remains a mystery that still resists complete understanding. We may never know exactly who she was. No glyph recorded her name. No stele told her story. Yet the care of her burial, the richness of her offerings, and the symbolism of her crimson-covered bones all speak of a woman of great importance, not merely as a wife or consort, but as someone with real influence, spiritual authority, and royal blood. Today, the Red Queen forces us to reconsider old assumptions. She reminds us that in the ancient Maya world, women were not silent. They led rituals, governed cities, and shaped dynasties. While kings like Paco long held the spotlight, the Red Queen's return reminds us that power did not belong to men alone. It flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy is more than the treasures left behind. It is the conversation she has inspired among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Every jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, every architectural choice in the temple tells us something intentional. This woman mattered. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary part of her story, not what we know, but what we still do not know. The Red Queen teaches us that history is not only a collection of facts. It is a living puzzle, a shared human desire to connect with the past. In that sense, her legacy is still unfolding. She lies wrapped in red, the color of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, once hidden behind a jade mask, now looks back at us through science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless but not voiceless, mysterious but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death she rules something even greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone. Her story was written in silence. Yet somehow she still speaks. Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in the vibrant district of Cucan, then a village on the edge of Mexico City. Her childhood home, the Casa Azul, the Blue House, was filled with color, contradiction, and quiet strength. It would later become a refuge, a battleground, and a museum dedicated to one of the most iconic artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of 4 daughters born to Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilda Calderon, a devout Catholic of indigenous and Spanish heritage. Her parents were opposites. Guillermo was reserved and intellectual. Matilda was religious and emotionally distant. Frida inherited her father's introspection and artistic vision, but also her mother's fierce resilience. As a child, Frida was imaginative, outspoken, and fearless. She read constantly and asked questions many adults preferred to avoid. But at the age of 6, she contracted polio, which left her right leg thinner and weaker than the other. It was a physical difference she tried to hide with long skirts, but never allowed to limit her spirit. The illness left her bedridden for months and separated from other children. During that time, she grew close to her father, who encouraged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and stay mentally active. Unlike many girls of her era, Frida did not dream of becoming a wife or homemaker. Her goal was to become a doctor. She enrolled in the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City at age 15, one of only a small number of girls admitted. There, she stood out not only for her intelligence, but for her rebellious humor, radical ideas, and distinctive style. She joined a group of young intellectuals known as the Cachuchas, who debated philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was drawn to revolution and to ideas that challenged tradition. But even in those early years, before the bus accident that would reshape her body and before the fame that would define her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already creating herself in the world, with sharp edges, unapologetic beliefs, and an identity too large to fit inside anyone else's expectations. She was not simply growing up in Cucan. She was preparing to reinvent herself entirely. On September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life was divided in two: the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon, she boarded a wooden bus with her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias, after school. They were laughing, teasing each other, and likely arguing. Frida never did anything halfway. But moments later, the bus collided with a streetcar, and in an instant, her future broke apart into pain, metal, and silence. Frida was impaled by an iron handrail. It entered her left hip and exited through her pelvis. Her spinal column fractured in 3 places. Her right leg shattered. Her foot dislocated. Her collarbone and ribs broke. Her shoulder was dislocated. Her abdomen was pierced. She was only 18 years old. A man covered her with a borrowed overcoat. Someone else noticed her body was sparkling, not from blood, but from the gold powder she had been carrying in a pouch. It had burst on impact, covering her broken body in what looked like shining ash. Frida was taken to the Red Cross hospital and underwent many surgeries over the following months. She spent weeks in a body cast, flat on her back, unable to move, struggling with infection and uncertainty. The future she had imagined of becoming a doctor moved further away with every passing day. But in that stillness, something began to grow. Her father gave her brushes. Her mother arranged a special easel above her bed. A mirror was placed on the canopy so she could see herself. And there, lying in plaster and pain, Frida began to paint. At first out of boredom, then out of obsession. Her first subjects were her own reflection, because she was all she had. But what emerged was not vanity. It was survival. The crash had broken her body, but it had also opened a door. A door into her own mind, her own body, and eventually into the surreal language of pain and identity that would define her art. The girl who wanted to heal others now began healing herself, one brushstroke at a time. As Frida Kahlo lay surrounded by plaster and steel, a body fighting itself with every breath, she began to paint. What started as therapy soon became a language. And that language was deeply personal, brutally honest, and often difficult to look at, which was exactly the point. Frida did not paint pretty flowers or polite landscapes. She painted pain, her pain, physical, emotional, and existential. Her first subjects were self-portraits, not because she was vain, but because, as she famously said, "I paint myself because I am so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Her early works were small in scale, painted on tin or wood panels inspired by Mexican retablos, devotional paintings meant to tell stories of suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition inward. Her body became the canvas. Her emotions became the altar. She painted herself as split, pierced, and bleeding. In one painting, she is covered with nails like a modern martyr. In another, she floats in a barren landscape, tied to a broken column, a symbol of her shattered spine. She painted herself weeping, fractured, decapitated, and bare, but never passive. Always watching. Her pain was never softened. She painted the ugliness of trauma with beauty, defiance, and even humor. Each piece was a reclaiming of her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a world that often tried to define her. But Frida was not only telling her story. She was creating a new kind of visual narrative, one that blended Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and symbolism. Her paintings became dreamlike examinations of her soul, framed in color, culture, and myth. By the time she recovered enough to walk again, though painfully, Frida was no longer the girl who had wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art was unlike anything people had seen. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into a source of creation. Frida Kahlo did not just paint her pain. She made the world look at it, and in doing so, she turned suffering into a sacred act of self-expression. In 1928, still recovering, still painting, and only 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the most important and turbulent relationship of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years older than her, already Mexico's most famous painter. Massive in both stature and presence, Rivera was a giant of Mexican muralism, known for his sweeping, politically charged frescoes that told the story of the Mexican people. Frida had seen his work before. She admired it, but now she wanted his opinion of her own work. She brought her paintings to him at the Ministry of Education, interrupting his scaffold project to ask directly, "Do I have talent?" Diego took one look and said yes, and not out of kindness. He recognized in her something rare, an unfiltered voice, raw and honest, full of rage, irony, pain, and beauty. They began a relationship that was as consuming as it was creative. Frida once said, "I suffered 2 accidents in my life. One in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other was Diego." They married in 1929. An unusual pairing to outsiders. Diego, massive, unfaithful, politically famous. Frida, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, already walking with a cane. Her parents called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was passionate but chaotic. Diego supported her art and encouraged her growth as a painter. But he was also repeatedly unfaithful, even with Frida's own sister, Cristina. Frida was devastated, and in response, she took lovers of her own, both men and women, including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and painter Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939, then remarried a year later under different terms. This time, Frida would keep her autonomy, her home, her money, and her name. Their second marriage was less about traditional love and more about creative partnership and mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals and heartbreak, Diego remained a constant force in Frida's life. He challenged her. He hurt her, but he also believed in her as an artist, as a revolutionary, and as a woman who could redefine what painting could be. Together, they were not peaceful, but they were legendary. In the 1930s, Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera on a journey north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York as he completed major mural commissions. These years abroad brought her face to face with American industrialism, wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism, and they left her with deep political discomfort. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and an admirer of indigenous traditions. The luxury she witnessed in the United States, especially while the Great Depression devastated much of the country, only deepened her disillusionment. In letters home, she mocked the culture's materialism and obsession with appearances. She missed the grit, color, and contradiction of Mexico. While Diego painted enormous murals on factory walls, Frida began painting smaller, quieter revolutions, deeply personal works on tin and canvas. Her style became clear, sharp, surreal, emotional, and intimate. It was during this time that she created some of her most iconic self-portraits. Frida did not paint herself out of vanity. She painted herself to survive. Her identity became her landscape. With her body constantly in pain from the accident, multiple surgeries, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit, she turned inward. Her portraits showed her bleeding, fragmented, exposed. Yet her face was always calm, always direct, unapologetic. One of her most powerful works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying on a hospital bed, crying, surrounded by floating symbols of loss. A fetus, a snail, medical equipment, a cracked pelvis. It was raw, graphic, and deeply emotional. A canvas that bled with truth. Back in Mexico, Frida immersed herself in leftist politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he lived in exile. Frida wore Tijuana dresses, traditional indigenous garments, not only as fashion, but as a political and cultural statement. Her art was never separated from her beliefs. Her identity, her body, and her ideology were all deeply connected in her work. While Rivera painted murals of revolution, Frida painted its human cost. The broken body, the burning mind, and the self always looking back. In exile and in illness, she became not only a painter of pain, but a painter of resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer simply Diego Rivera's wife. She had become something entirely different, a force, an artist whose work shined with raw honesty, surreal symbolism, and cultural identity. Back in her homeland, she fully embraced herself. Her Casa Azul in Coyoacan became a sanctuary of color and contradiction. Bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, Aztec statues in the garden, monkeys and parrots moving freely. The house was a living reflection of Frida's imagination. It blended tradition and rebellion, elegance and earth. There she surrounded herself with pre-Columbian artifacts, textiles, folk art, and revolutionary books. She wore bold Tijuana dresses, wove flowers into her hair, and painted among the scent of copal incense and the sounds of mariachi music outside. This period marked an explosion of creativity. Her paintings became more detailed, more symbolic, and more political. Works like the two Fridas revealed a divided self. One in European clothing with a bleeding heart, the other in indigenous dress, strong and calm. It was Frida's visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and heritage. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris, where artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her fiercely original style. But even among the surrealists, Frida stood apart. When André Breton tried to label her as one of them, she resisted. "They thought I was a surrealist," she said. "But I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." She painted Mexico, not the romantic postcard version, but the living, breathing country she deeply loved. Her work pulsed with symbolism. Skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, corn, and blood. She honored the indigenous roots of her homeland while exposing the violence of its past and present. But even as her artistic voice grew stronger, her health continued to decline. Multiple surgeries, infections, and chronic pain became part of daily life. Still, she painted through it all, propped up in bed, torso locked in corsets, fingers gripping the brush. Frida had returned to Mexico not to rest, but to reclaim her power through paint, through politics, and through her fearless embrace of self. As the 1940s continued, Frida Kahlo's body kept betraying her. Her spine was deteriorating. Her right leg was constantly infected. She underwent more than 30 surgeries in her lifetime, often one after another. At times, she was bedridden for months, trapped in body casts or immobilized by traction devices that pulled her bones apart. But still she painted. Each canvas during these years became both release and resistance. Her work grew darker and more defiant. She painted with a clarity sharpened by pain, refusing to hide behind metaphor. In the broken column, she showed herself split down the middle, her body pierced with nails, a cracked ionic column replacing her spine. Yet her face remained calm, her gaze steady. Pain for Frida was no longer only a subject. It was her companion, her enemy, her muse. Her political voice also became louder. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in demonstrations, wrote passionate letters, and spoke against imperialism and injustice. When her health no longer allowed her to walk, she still appeared at protests in a wheelchair, firmly holding signs and shouting slogans. In 1953, Frida was given her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a long overdue celebration of her art. But her health was so fragile that doctors told her she could not attend. So she did what only Frida would do. She arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the gallery on her hospital bed. Dressed in traditional clothing, surrounded by her own work, she welcomed guests with tequila, laughter, and the same fire burning in her eyes. Her final paintings were both childlike and haunting. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she painted herself wearing a steel corset, supported by the hands of Marx, casting away symbols of oppression. Her last known work was a still life of sliced watermelons. One piece carried the words, "Viva la vida, long live life." Even in the face of death, she remained defiant, joyful, and political. Frida Kahlo's last portraits were not only self-portraits. They were acts of revolution, painted in pain, but always signed with life. On July 13, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the same place where she had been born, La Casa Azul in Culiacan. The official cause was listed as a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her believed something deeper had ended her life. She had been ill, yes, but also exhausted by pain, by surgeries, and by the long battle with her own body. Just days before, she had attended a political protest against the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala. Weak and confined to a wheelchair, she insisted on going, her clenched fist raised high. Revolution remained her final heartbeat. Her last diary entry was short but powerful. "I hope the exit is joyful and I hope never to return." Frida's funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most respected cultural institution. Her body, covered in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was devastated. He called her the greatest love of his life, even though his betrayals had nearly broken her. But in the years after her death, something remarkable happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name was remembered only in art circles. Her work was difficult to classify, too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But slowly her image, her story, and her defiance began to connect with people everywhere. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as feminist scholars and activists reclaimed forgotten voices, Frida's became stronger. She was no longer only a painter. She became a symbol of pain transformed into beauty, of feminism born through resistance, of Mexican identity celebrated proudly, of queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her face, unibrow, steady gaze, and flowers in her hair became iconic. Her home became a museum. Her diary became sacred reading. Her paintings now hang in the world's greatest museums. Frida Kahlo had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow. But in death, she stepped forward. She did not only leave behind paintings. She left behind a mirror and challenged us all to look. Not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's face is everywhere. Printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, turned into dolls, memes, posters, and symbols. Her signature unibrow, her flower-crowned hair, her direct gaze, all instantly recognized. But what makes her legacy powerful is not only that people know her face, but that they understand the truth behind it. Frida did not try to be flawless. She did not fit into boxes. She was never conventional, and she had no desire to be. In a world that demands perfection, she gave us honesty. Raw, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful, contradictory honesty. She celebrated what made her different. Her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and turned it all into art that crossed borders and generations. She became more than an artist. She became a global symbol of defiance, feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. For queer communities, she remains a fearless bisexual icon who lived openly and unapologetically in a time that demanded silence. For women, she remains a reminder that power never requires permission. For disabled artists, she remains proof that pain can power the brush instead of stopping it. And for Mexico, she is a reclaimed daughter, fierce, folkloric, and forever part of the nation's soul. Her paintings, once dismissed as too unusual or too personal, are now considered among the most respected in the world. Works like the two Fridas, self-portrait with thorn necklace and hummingbird, and the broken column are not simply viewed, they are deeply felt by anyone who has suffered and needed to transform that pain into something meaningful. She lived on the margins and turned them into the center of attention. She embraced contradiction. A communist who wore gold. A woman betrayed who chose to love again. A body in pieces, yet a spirit that could not be broken. And through it all, she painted, not only with color, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never asked to become a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself. In doing so, she also told the truth for millions of others who had never seen themselves represented in art before. Now when we see her face, we see courage. We see color. We see resistance. We see Frida, not gone, but immortal.